And this meeting is organised by Workers' Liberty. It's part of a series of socialist environmental reading groups that we're organising. Today's meeting is also hosted by CopView, who I hope will have a bit of time, probably towards the end, just to introduce their project. And we're going to have, it's going to take the form of a presentation by two people who take different views on the readings anyway. I think both of them maybe are still thinking about their position, but it's a debate about the degrowth debate among eco-socialists. So we'll have Zack taking one side, I suppose a more skeptical view of the degrowth idea of promoting degrowth. And then we'll have Luke, I think it'll be the other way around. First of all, we'll have Luke, who's sympathetic to the idea that eco-socialists or socialists or ecologists should promote the ideas of degrowth.
Hiya, yeah. All right, yeah. I suppose I'm not really gonna make the case too strongly at this point. What I want to do is I want to present the main ideas of the Socialism Without Growth article, and I want to outline some critiques. But actually, I think it would be good if, because the format is that then Zack will present the article, which is a critique, I think, which I do agree with a lot of, but then it would make sense if maybe I can speak later in the meeting a little bit about a commentary on the Schwartzman piece, if that's okay. And I'm also, yeah, I'll leave it a little bit open, so actually you can hear what the rest of the reading group thinks about this. Yeah, so this is maybe some relevant background to the whole discussion. I think it's a bit of a problem that Karlos doesn't really talk about this. I think he could ground this discussion better if we talk about planetary boundaries, if we talk about what degrowth means for climate change. Maybe we can come on to that later. But I think that I just want to draw everyone's attention to that, because I think it's important to bear that in mind in terms of also what Schwartzman advocate later on. I just want to do a tiny little bit on the history of the degrowth thing. If anyone read the Eric Pino article, there's in the first few paragraphs there's just a tiny little history. It comes from France in the 70s. Pino cites André Gorz, Cornelius Castoriadis, and Serge Latouche, who broke away from the mainstream French Marxism and developed an ecological critique of the progressivist imaginary that was seen to characterize both capitalist and socialist thought. They saw the need to acknowledge that any truly emancipatory project had to recognize first that the existence of ecological and social limits, and that these could be in no way overcome by a progressivist free en avant, which I think means advance, through more production, better technologies, and more transparent social relations. We cannot grow ourselves out of these limits, and more is not an answer to social injustice or a solution to capitalism's contradictions. Whereas most socialists thought, while envisioning a revolution of the social relations of production, premised the continuity of the material trajectory of modern society from capitalism to socialism, degrowth or décroissance held that a socialist or communistic unleashing of productive forces, constrained and skewed in their potential by the shell of capitalist productive relations, would be as disastrous as a capitalist trajectory that we are currently following. That, I think, gives a little flavour of where it comes from, and perhaps of its importance to the current discussion over how we should respond to the ecological crisis. Can you get the next slide, please, Zack? This is the first one of Karlos's argument. Karlos's article from 2017 posits the idea of socialism without growth. His core argument is that economic growth is ecologically unsustainable. He actually says whether or not growth is capitalist or socialist doesn't make a difference. The issue is that growth of the material standard of living requires growth of materials extraction, and this is unavoidably damaging and undermines the conditions of production and reproduction. He makes the argument that, drawing a little bit from value theory, from capital, but not very systematically, I think, he makes the argument that use values don't grow. He says socialism is concerned with use values, not exchange values, but use values cannot grow in the aggregate. Socialists, he then redefines what growth is a little bit, and this is contentious and comes up in the Schwartzman piece. He says socialists should not use the word growth for improvements in things like health and education. We are not dealing with quantitative dimensions, but with sufficiency. And sufficiency should be the starting point rather than the compound rate of growth associated with modern GDP. I think this sidesteps the issue a little bit, because the provision of universal needs under something like socialism would, at some level, mean a quantitative increase of some production of services and infrastructures to meet basic needs. This is addressed in the Schwartzman piece a little bit. It's also an issue here that Karlos refuses to define socialism in his piece on socialism. He says, if any economic growth is ecologically unsustainable, then the precise definition of socialism does not matter. I'm not arguing that socialism is the best model for a degrowth transition. It seems a little bit like, yeah, a little bit like he's dodging the question, and maybe it reflects some of the politics that come out later in the piece, where he seems to understand the socialist movement through Corbyn and Sanders and Podemos, for example. So yeah, he says that no growth can be sustained ecologically. It requires growing surpluses, which in practice involve exploitation. A starting point should be sufficiency, as I've said. There's always been enough, he says, for everyone, if only we shared. He says that energy and material throughput have to degrow because extraction causes huge damage. The amount of energy we circulate and use is directly related to environmental impacts. So doubling or quadrupling the amount of energy produced and materials extracted because of this will sooner or later overshadow qualitative differences between, for example, fossil fuels and renewable energy. Okay. He says something important, which I think is repeated on the Green left a little bit, which is the idea that an indefinite growth of renewable energy is good. He critiques this, he said this is an eco-modernist view. It isn't in line with the ecological critique of an ecological understanding of what's going on. His basic hypothesis, he says, is that renewable energies are not adopted because they cannot sustain an economy of the scale, the size, and the pace of the contemporary global economy. This will not be different under socialism. What can be different is the ability to prosper with a smaller renewable economy by sharing resources better. Can we get the next one, please, Zach? He makes the argument that economic growth rests on exploitation specifically, so that non-exploitative economic growth is unlikely. I don't think it's quite explained. It doesn't explain why growth under socialism must necessarily be exploitative. It surely depends on the provision of the surplus. It's an allocation problem. Exploitation is also a matter of the relationship between the value, labour, and the surplus and production. Under socialism, if this would be different, what would that mean for growth? That's something that maybe we can discuss. He also displays a determinist view in this section, where he discusses the Soviet Union, and he claims that it developed into a hierarchical society because of the accumulation of big surpluses. I think this shows one of the important divergences between his or that particular way of thinking about the growth question and an ecological Marxist approach. Finally, he argues that socialist policies are likely to have a negative effect on growth. In other words, socialism is less likely than capitalism to be a system of growth. I think this is important because actually historically and now the program of the labour movement, the program of the revolutionary left does advocate some forms of some shrinkages, some degrowth. For example, we are in favour of degrowing carbon emissions rapidly. We are in favour of degrowing the financial sector, the armament industry, the advertising industry. We're in favour of degrowing drudgery, and we're in favour of degrowing the state. So I think there's an important point he does make at the end. The next one, please, Zach. I don't know if anyone read the Eric Pino article. I think there was a lot of reading, so fair enough if you didn't. But Pino says some important things, I think. What he actually discusses the working class, which doesn't really feature at all in Karlos's argument. Pino says that one of the difficulties of for the left and the labour movement and the question of growth is that the working class is inherently tied to capitalist growth, defined by something he calls, or he refers to as the treadmill of accumulation. Pino says that Marx explains why growth is a necessary feature of the capitalist economy, but the relationship between use value and biophysical throughput, a key concept in the discourse, has not been theorized, and this is the work of ecological economics. Whereas Karlos defines unsustainable quantitative material standards of living as the cause of the problem, Pino emphasizes the tendency towards crisis in the capitalist economy. It says that the cause of that is overaccumulation. It says that growth is both a quantitative expansion of the economic system and qualitative change in the social relations of production and consumption. Growth of quantitative expansion means more use values are produced. Some of these are produced specifically for the need of profit, they're capitalist use values, and these have not an effect of being in the form of waste, and that is his theory of growth essentially. You've also got the transformation of social relations, which indicates more intensive accumulation, so more machinery, more tools. This also gives rise to new use values, and both of these in tandem effect imply growing material throughput, a greater use of resources in the overall economy. Degrowth has focused on the question of scale. It means shrinking the throughput on which the material standards of most people in modern society depend. The overaccumulation approach put forward by Pino stresses that the problem of surplus absorption and the imperative to try and find avenues to absorb the surplus, which determines the metabolism of capitalist economies. Okay. Is there another slide on Pino there, like the next one? Okay, cool, yeah. Next one. He says that a socialist society could redirect the surplus towards rational and ethical ends. This has always been the aim of socialism. And this could include ecological restoration and modernization. Ecological Marxism, this is a quote from Pino, has inherited this focus on the qualitative dimension of the surplus. Thus, where degrowth sees a problem of scale, a Marxist would see a problem of allocation, and this is what leads some eco-Marxists to argue that there is room for socialist growth inside the boundaries set by contemporary earth science. Karlos, however, argues such questions of reallocation of productive activity have nothing to do with economic growth as an aggregate phenomenon with multiplier effects and throughput linkages, nor are they to do with growth as an ideological or political mediation that is contained and the internal contradictions of advanced capitalism. This is where, Pino says, this is where the eco-Marxist attachment to growth is most suspect. I think I would agree with that. Finally, he stresses this point about the working class again. He says that their class identity has been redeployed from the world of value production to the world of value absorption, develop consumption and consumerism, with the capacity to maintain or enhance the material standard of living as defined by capitalist use values being central to their identity and their collective agency as workers. Thus, the class position of the working class is inherently tied to growth. One of the things I'd like to argue for, perhaps in the discussion, is that we need to find ways that we can intervene in the labour movement to try and have policies which can break this relationship. I think that's an important task for the eco-socialist movement. Okay, the next slide, please. Zach. How long have we got left there for here?
You're doing fine.
All right, I might talk for a couple more minutes.
Yeah, fine.
So the question I think is these frameworks, both by Karlos and Pino, as I've quickly, maybe in a quite intense way, presented, is it a convincing way? Is it convincing as to why the struggle against growth as such, growth being the central pillar, should this be the organizing principle of how ecological socialist thinking, strategy, and practice takes place? I'd argue that it's better understood as an important complement to existing Marxist politics and should play an important role in how we intervene in the program of the labour movement. But the point is that it has to be complemented by an attitude towards the labour movement, which I think is completely foreign to most of the degrowth movement. And likewise, most of the labour movement is partly foreign to some of these ideas. That said, you can also point to things like reduction of working time, which has been a classic demand of the workers' movement, is a core policy of degrowth. It means sharing work better in order to overall produce perhaps less, whilst maintaining standard of living. That seems like a reasonably ecological policy, which shows the way that you can converge the two paradigms. Certainly, it's true that aspects of the degrowth thought are the most concrete articulations of what an eco-socialist policy would have to involve. I think that's important, and that's missed quite often. Ecological economics and the degrowth school seem to me to be important contributions, much more fitting to the age of ecological crisis than just the classical Marxist program. The two have to converge, which doesn't mean watering down doesn't mean watering down the emphasis on a working class seizure of power, but it does mean that has to have an ecological orientation. I think it also shows why we shouldn't be so hesitant as socialists to talk about consumption as well as production. I think a lot of the way that the environmental left has historically discussed consumption is classist, and doesn't take seriously the needs of working class people and that people's right to live a culturally rich life. Yeah, I think this framework shows why it's important for us to take on that in terms of transport, also in terms of the actual things that we do in daily life. I think this has to be a discussion that the left isn't afraid to make, but it has to do it in a way which puts the working class at the centre. As I said just before, the working class movement, the social movement, has always advocated some things which I would argue can be identified with degrowth of the consumption of the rich, degrowth of carbon emissions of the financial sector, militaries and the police, degrowth of the state. But the question has to be both about developing an adequate understanding of why and how ecologically destructive growth happens, and to find ways that change in the position of the working class in the entire process, decoupling our connection to the connection of employment and unemployment to capitalist growth. That seems to me to be the important task to converge these two things. I haven't really talked much about the ways in which they're totally incompatible, because I think there are some. I think they're important, but maybe we can come to that in the discussion. Yeah, so that's all I've got to say for now. Thanks for listening. I guess over to you, Zack.
Well, I'm going to. I think like the gap between me and Luke is certainly not as big as like opposing. Although I think there are some disagreements. So what I'm going to talk about in my talk, I'm not actually just going to mostly just kind of summarize the Schwartzman piece, but this is my plan. So I'm going to kind of critique the concept or word or movement degrowth, but then I'm also going to, as part of doing that, I'm going to try and kind of bring out some of the useful ideas that I think we can take from some of the readings, both readings which advocate something in the direction of degrowth and those which are critical, and in the process touch on some of the readings, both the kind of two core ones and the longer list. So to kind of give it an overview, so one of the later readings, not the two, but Lowley's Eco-Socialism and or Degrowth, gives quite a concise summary of a lot of the kind of classical eco-socialist critiques of degrowth, which I think you can see more broadly, and a lot of people reading even the first reading, you might have thought of these things straight away, and I think three of them are kind of vagueness and or incompleteness, secondly kind of softness on capitalism, and thirdly overlooking kind of important elements or sectors or types of growth. So I'm putting quotes there, but I'm going to talk about each in turn. Okay, so vagueness. So what does it mean, or what are we degrowing? So I think, if you even just a kind of short look at the literature here is, if you ask, like, as I said in title day, I think if you ask like 5 proponents of degrowth, what degrowth means, then you'll get 20 different answers. A lot of them very contradictory. And I think it's also worth noting that there's a very big gap often between different kind of wings of the degrowth movement. So what these readings are is a kind of debate on degrowth within a kind of like socialist orientated element of the degrowth movement. That's quite different from the degrowth academia and the kind of degrowth movement. So just kind of quickly go through what some of the meanings might be, and what kind of an eco-socialist response that I would probably put forward would be. So the kind of first thought might be, okay, people talk about growth, so that's kind of economic growth, that's growing GDP, gross domestic product, year on year, and so degrowth is reversing that process, so shrinking GDP. However, a kind of socialist response to that would be that, like, the concept of GDP only makes sense in the concept of capitalist society, like the NHS, for example, in the UK, the National Health Service, ignoring the kind of large partial privatization of it, that is a very large kind of infrastructure, kind of organizational system, but which is not geared towards like private profit, and as such doesn't directly factor in GDP in the same way, at least that other things do, and mostly kind of factors as a cost. And so, in a socialist society organized towards kind of human and environmental kind of needs and desires, and organized democratically rather than in pursuit of private profit, the concept of GDP loses meaning. And then that kind of next thought for me, I haven't come across it often said quite so starkly, but is the idea that maybe we're trying to shrink net human labor. So I think for Marxists, for a lot of socialists, we advocate something kind of close to a labor theory of value, which is that, like, the kind of basis of kind of exchange value of of money, which within a capitalist society goes and forms GDP, and that's kind of in a sense based on the kind of aggregate human labor that is involved in producing that goods or services. And so, if you're trying to abstract, kind of generalize the idea of GDP beyond capitalism, then would we be talking about net human labor? And so I think that kind of comes into the kind of idea of a short working week, which we can talk about labor. But I guess, like, my core answer here would be, that the problem is labor in pursuit of private profit, and it, in particular, labor in pursuit of private profit within a capitalist society, kind of endless pursuit of more and more profit by different companies, which on the scale of societies translates into an endless pursuit of more and more growth. And we would then also have a context of competing capitalist states, each competing with each other in terms of growth, but also with each other in terms of making themselves most attractive to, like, international capital. So that drive doesn't factor in any direct way ecological goods, planetary boundaries, human welfare, or anything. And the kind of more and more labor in that context is more and more labor in the service of our class enemies, who don't take these things into account. But labor in itself isn't a bad thing, and it can help in lots of ways that we can talk about. And kind of third thing, which is talked about in Karlos and others, is the idea of kind of degrowing of use values. So, you know, a use value is, you know, if you have something like, you know, an apple here, its exchange value is, you know, 60 pence or however much I bought it for. Its use value is the kind of use that I get out of it, the kind of flavor, taste, the kind of, you know, nourishment in terms of like vitamins and calories and so on. You know, it's different obviously with like, you know, a phone or something like that, but that also has its use value. And that kind of links to, you know, Karlos talks about and others talk about kind of material standard of living. You know, I think in some levels, you know, there are areas that would want to be kind of shrunk in terms of those things, but you know, I think in another sense, you know, something that you know, by far not the greatest evil of capitalism, but something that, you know, I find intensely irritating about capitalism, to say the least, is a kind of like planned obsolescence of kind of commodities, and that kind of limits their use values. As in, like, you know, you like buy a I don't know, like a phone, for example, and you know, it has a certain amount of use, but it's designed in such a way that it, you know, it is in the interests of the producers of phones that the phone is kind of breaks and or is superseded within like quite a short time period. That's not a fact of science or technology, but is the nature of our society. And you know, in a different society, the like goods could last a lot longer. Potentially they could be created in a kind of more modular way, so they're more easily repaired, and so you could have potentially a kind of greater use values without that meaning kind of greater production of goods. Even, you know, another point is kind of depletion, pollution, environmental destructions, that we want to degrow them. I mean, I think that is that's obviously true, and is a point worth making, but I don't think that's kind of an adequate criteria to distinguish degrowth from kind of other things. Energy and material throughput. Again, you know, I'll talk later in terms of things that we might want to grow. I think there's some interesting things in talking about that. And finally, so one of the pieces was like, you know, what does degrowth mean? I don't think it was called exactly that, but one of the readings was like that, and one of the core things it said is, you know, that the kind of like there's a provocation in this term. It's not clear immediately what it means, and it's maybe like it elicits quite a kind of strong emotional reaction from people. But I think like our political tradition as kind of revolutionary socialists would kind of advocate a clear and bold politics. It is actually a lot more radical. Okay, so next point, kind of capitalism. So I think this kind of, for me, in many ways, is a kind of strongest, or is a very strong critique of kind of degrowth movement, but also a kind of something that there's kind of potentially a lot to take from aspects of the kind of literature and the kind of insights. So Hickel and Karlos in one of the articles, like they sketch how kind of various different international capitalist institutions, from like the World Bank to you know, others which are kind of ostensibly more directly concerned with environmental things, and like kind of a lot of mainstream politics, liberal environmentalists advocate a form of green growth, where GDP will continue to grow, but the growth of GDP is decoupled from the growing like environmental destruction, and they demonstrate kind of quite persuasively, mostly talking about kind of depletion, pollution, and kind of depletion and those kind of things, less than kind of greenhouse gases, but they do talk about that as well. But they demonstrate very, very persuasively that like in practice, at least within a society that's kind of comparably similar to ours, that's not possible. That empirically the opposite has happened. As growth as GDP has grown, actually the kind of the material footprint has grown at a faster pace. And you know, they cite a statistic that about how kind of recycling wouldn't solve it, because like 44%. I can dig it out, but quite a large proportion is things like food, which are kind of directly consumed, and also kind of infrastructure. And I think there's kind of that final claim, I think is quite kind of, there's a lot to kind of unpick and critique in that. I think it's kind of short-sighted in its kind of concept of kind of recycling and what a circular economy might mean. But I think there's kind of useful insights there. However, most kind of degrowth critics of green growth kind of stop there. And in a sense, what is advocated in green growth is more or less synonymous with green capitalism. And as such, like, the kind of research that they put forward in this paper, for example, I think is quite valuable as a critique of the idea of green capitalism, and kind of like empirical evidence that we can use in that argument, but that it should be expanded and generalized to a kind of general critique of capitalism, including, and I think this is quite valuable, kind of green Keynesianism, which I think you did see with kind of Corbynism and Sanders in many sense, which looks for kind of more socially just capitalism, but still a capitalism, and which is kind of environmentally good. How am I doing for time, Vicky?
Yes, you need to move on a bit.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll have to skip some things. So I think there's a kind of removal of capitalism class dynamics from kind of talking about these things, and that in practice that means that often degrowth is a kind of road, certainly often not towards radical politics, sometimes away from radical politics and kind of towards academia liberalism and so on. And I guess I think there's a very powerful Marxist critique of it's built into the cell structure of capitalism that an attempt to accumulate capital, to throw more and more capitalism into accumulation, into the kind of circuit of production, and kind of outcompete other capitalists, and the way that kind of extends to a kind of the environmental destruction which degrowth is put down to simply growth. I think that the Marxist kind of perspective is more powerful and deeper, but I will kind of skip over that. Things that we might want to grow, I will touch on all of these in detail. I think a lot of them are touched on in the readings, but also, perhaps kind of occurred to people as they were reading the original thing is, obviously in terms of social justice and environmental things, there's a lot of areas that we do want to grow. We might want to kind of think about beyond just a kind of transition to like a zero carbon society, kind of climate interventions in terms of rewilding, afforestation, maybe even kind of forms of carbon sequestration, other things, like that's an area of human labor that I think we would want to grow basically as much as possible, at least for the next few hundred years. And the kind of human flourishing in other ways, like advances in kind of public health. And I guess, so I would say kind of, whilst there are other good reasons for kind of reducing net wage labor, I don't think there's in a kind of direct and fundamental way, a kind of environmental case for this. I think there's also a kind of critique that can be made of the link between some of these ideas and saying kind of wider kind of Stalinist and third politics, third worldist kind of politics. I mean, so some other valuable things in the literature. I'm not going to say much about these, because like I touched on some already, and Luke's touched on the first two already. I'd make some critiques of the stuff about overconsumption. Luke talked about, although I think it's very valuable. And I guess to kind of summarize it all, like I think there's a lot to critique, and that we need to critique in the kind of concept of degrowth, but that we can take stuff from kind of engaging with the literature and use it to kind of flesh out a kind of Marxist ecology in a better way. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Now I'd like to give Zack and Luke an ample time to come back. So I don't know if Zack and Luke, you're ready to reply to the discussion.
Yeah, fine. Yeah. So a few different things. There's more things than I've got time to respond on, but I think it was a very interesting discussion. I mean, I don't think anyone here has defended degrowth as a slogan. I think it's straightforwardly not a good slogan. It's not clear, and it's, to the extent it is, it's not necessarily good. However, I think decommodification is interesting. I mean, I guess I think like for me, the kind of valuable thing is kind of it is that we can take from it is kind of, you know, what can we learn from engaging with these ideas and with the literature. I mean, one of my first thoughts with engaging in terms of what Janet was just saying, in terms of like stuff that we can take for our program, one of my first thoughts with reading some of this is, okay, well, like a lot of this stuff is stuff that, you know, eco-socialists, you know, or I at least would have been advocating anyway without using the label degrowth. So, you know, stuff around like expanding public transport and correspondingly, you know, shrink and also stuff about like, you know, walking and cycling and shrinking kind of the number of cars, and whatever cars there are left, kind of collectivize them and kind of so shrinking it there. Or, you know, like, I think it's, you know, a socialist society would naturally strive to a lot less waste. I think there are other things that we do want to kind of think about. So just to kind of clarify a point from what Tony said, so I think I didn't explain very well. I wasn't saying that GDP that the NHS doesn't feature in GDP expenditure, but that the NHS, excluding the privatized parts of it, if my understanding is right, doesn't feature as a kind of source of GDP. It doesn't contribute towards GDP. It features on the kind of outgoing rather than a kind of ingoing. Now, I think that's true. Even if I'm wrong, I guess the point kind of generalizes more, which is that, you know, in a socialist society, what we strive towards is kind of human well-being, environmental well-being, like organized democratically by everyone, and like increasingly kind of monetary indicators will become kind of less important as we kind of, you know, phase out money, and so kind of GDP, like no genuine eco-socialist would kind of advocate GDP growth. I guess I wanted to kind of briefly say something about the kind of anti-communism of a lot of people in the kind of degrowth movement. Now, I think that is kind of is true, but I think it's also worth, and like they're wrong, obviously, you know, but I think it's also worth kind of understanding where that's come from. So, like, you know, in Workers' Liberty, we are very strongly like anti-Stalinist communists or socialists, but I think it's, you know, the gap between the labour movement and the socialist movement and the environmental movement isn't particularly the fault of the environmentalists or kind of any sides more than the other sides, in that, you know, particularly in the origins of the degrowth movement, that happened when the USSR still existed, and the kind of really existing communism that was most loudly kind of advocated, not just there, but within labour movements around the world, was one which identified socialism with an extremely destructive society, both environmentally and socially. And, you know, I think like we advocate a kind of the kind of re-flourishing of environmental Marxism in the last couple of decades was kind of hidden beneath Stalinism. And so I think, you know, obviously we think it's possible to reject both, but I think it's kind of important to understand that. And yeah, I guess like kind of finally, I think the kind of, you know, the stuff that people talk about human nature, I think like most of what I might have said has been said. I think there's some kind of interesting stuff written in, there's a kind of book called The Spirit Level, written by some kind of liberal lefty sociologists that's quite interesting, who, you know, they make the case kind of quite, they talk about kind of inequality within societies. They make the case there, and it's made in other places, that, you know, in human well-being does increase with kind of wealth up to a threshold. So if you're on like poverty wages, your kind of well-being will be worse than other people, but that most advanced modern capitalist societies have got enough that kind of greater increases beyond that don't increase people's kind of well-being or happiness. And so I think kind of think about kind of human nature and selfishness. I think that's important for that. I think it's also important to think about how kind of class struggle can and other campaigning can really radically change people's ideas and their idea, their drives, their sense of self, their sense of their nature through big strikes, through wider campaigning. We've seen big changes in how people think about kind of climate change and kind of racism over the last couple of years, because of not even particularly class struggle, but just large mobilizations. And yeah, I think the kind of society that we kind of need to fight for through kind of class struggle, through organizing in the workplace, the place where capitalism is reproduced and more widely, it doesn't have to be one free of competition, in the kind of fire brigade. There's reportedly quite a lot of kind of competition between that workers have with each other about like how fast they can get ready in response to a call out. Now that's not a bad form of competition. That's like, saving people's lives. But like the idea that if people have inclinations to competition, that means that they have to want more and more stuff and want to kind of shit on other people. That does make sense to me. And certainly, if we have a system which doesn't kind of reward kind of almost psychopathic selfishness and kind of promote people who are like that to the kind of top of CEOs or political parties, then it's a very different one. So yeah, I think a big kind of take home from this is the need to kind of go out there and engage in these struggles and kind of take these ideas to the labour movement and the environmental movement. So yeah, thanks. I'll pass over to Luke now.
All right. Thank you to everyone who's contributed. So no one has really come out dead strong for the slogan of degrowth. That's because it's a shite slogan. But also no one, I think it's important, and I feel like that actually we should acknowledge that no one has also endorsed green growth, because actually that is the dominant ideology in society. There's a capitalist version of it, but there's also a labour movement reformist version of it, which is very, very influential. And I think that the fact that we've not endorsed that shows that we have a duty to fight it. It shows that actually that is something that should be on the agenda of eco-socialists, and isn't particularly on the agenda of eco-socialists, and that's a problem. And I don't think we should call it degrowth, but whether we call it degrowth or not, something like the critique of growth, the antidotes to growth, I like that, Janet, nice one. This stuff needs to be incorporated into our programme. That's why a more serious engagement with the degrowth literature, and yes, it's a literature, yes, it's academic, yes, it's aimed at policymakers, and yes, lots of it's liberal or utopian, but a serious engagement with that is an important thing for us to do, because we have a duty to present an alternative, not just which is socialist in the classical Marxian mass party sense, not just with the classical Marxist program, but which takes seriously the fact that capitalism has grown to a point that it is transgressing a number of the planetary boundaries, and we have a problem. We have a real duty to make our program respond to that properly. So yeah, that's all I'll say for that now. And I don't want to assume too much, but like I think actually that's the sense I get from this stuff, and also from other comrades who contributed, even though there was a lot of critique, and that's very welcome. To respond to a little bit of it, the argument that exploitation creates growth is not my argument. That was me paraphrasing what Karlos says. Karlos makes the claim, he does a logical claim. He says, well, because growth requires exploitation, then you can't have a socialist growth which is green, which doesn't involve exploitation too. So that's his kind of appeal to the socialist left, to say, let's think about what you mean by a socialist green growth. I don't think it's a strong argument in his piece, but his fundamental point that I think isn't wrong, but there's a wider point about his piece, which is true for a lot of the degrowth literature. They don't properly engage in the work of Marx and like the Marxist critique of political economy. They try to construct an economics without it. That's obviously a problem. Yeah. Again, the focus on consumption. I stand by that, but I think it's important that we clarify. I don't mean working class people consuming things per se. Clearly, there's an issue with transport. Clearly, there's an issue with car use. Clearly, there's an issue with flying. In general, working class people don't consume too much, but there's a problem of consumption at a systemic level, where there is an overproduction of commodities, which has an adverse environmental impact, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about that. At some level, that's talking about production. The point is that the two are integrated, and the socialist left has been too caught up in a concern to position itself near the working class that it hasn't talked about that. We should be unafraid to talk about that, but we need to obviously to find a way to do it, which is bold as well as sensitive to the fact that these issues are understood as an affront to employment or to leisure time. People's right to go on a foreign holiday is an important victory for the class historically, but needs to be reimagined. That's a hard thing to do, but refusing to do it would be a shirking of our duty to be ecological Marxists, not just Marxists in the old grey sense. I think I'll leave it there, actually. Thanks everyone for listening today.